There are moments in life when the universe conspires to place exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time, and what seems like a simple request from a child becomes the catalyst that shatters a man's carefully constructed walls and forces him to remember what it means to be human. For Marcus Webb, that moment arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon in a corner cafe when a small girl with tears streaming down her face approached his table clutching the broken pieces of a wooden airplane and asked him a question that would change everything he thought he understood about loss, fatherhood, and the unexpected ways grief finds its way toward healing. Marcus was 51 years old and looked like success personified. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, his suit was Italian and cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the watch on his wrist could have fed a family for a year. He was the founder and CEO of a multinational engineering firm, a man whose designs had reshaped skylines across 3 continents, whose name appeared on patents and in business journals and on the Forbes list of self-made billionaires. But beneath the expensive clothes and the aura of accomplishment was a man who had been hollow for 7 years, ever since the day his 12-year-old son Daniel died in a boating accident that Marcus had been too busy with a client meeting to prevent, too consumed by his empire building to notice until it was far too late. If you believe in the power of kindness, in second chances, and in the mysterious ways broken things find each other in the dark, please take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment about a time someone's small act of compassion changed your day, share this story with someone who needs to remember that hope still exists, and subscribe to our channel because we all need reminders that humanity is still worth believing in. Marcus had been sitting in the Riverside Cafe for nearly an hour, his laptop open in front of him displaying quarterly reports he couldn't bring himself to care about, his third espresso growing cold beside him. This cafe had become his refuge over the past year, a place where he could sit surrounded by the noise of other people's lives without having to participate in any of it. The owner knew not to make conversation, the regulars had learned to leave him alone, and he could spend hours here feeling simultaneously connected to the world and completely isolated from it, which was exactly the state he'd learned to exist in since Daniel's death. He was staring blankly at his screen when a shadow fell across his table, and he looked up with the irritation of someone whose solitude had been interrupted. Standing beside him was a girl of perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with dark braids coming loose from their ribbons and eyes that were red-rimmed from crying. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of outfits bought from thrift stores and treasured because there wasn't money for anything else. In her hands she held what had once been a wooden toy airplane, now broken into several pieces, and she was looking at him with an expression that combined desperate hope with the fear of rejection that children learn too early when life has been unkind to them. She spoke in a voice that trembled but remained clear, asking if he was the man who built things, because the cafe owner had told her he was an engineer, and she needed help fixing something very important. Marcus felt his chest tighten at the simple directness of her request, at the way she looked at him as if he might be someone who could solve problems instead of someone who was himself an unsolvable problem. He started to tell her he was busy, started to redirect her to someone else. Anyone else, but then she held up the broken airplane and the words that came out of her mouth stopped his heart completely. She said it was the last gift her daddy had given her before he died, that he'd made it himself in his woodshop, that it was the only thing she had left that his hands had touched. She said she'd been carrying it everywhere since he passed away 6 months ago, keeping it safe, but today at school another kid had grabbed it from her and thrown it against the wall and now it was broken and she didn't know how to fix it. Her voice broke on the last words, and tears began streaming down her face again as she explained that her mama worked 2 jobs and didn't have time for things like this, that they'd moved in with her grandmother after her daddy died because they couldn't afford their house anymore, that everything felt broken and she just needed this one thing to be whole again. Marcus sat frozen, every word landing on him like a physical blow. He saw his own son in this girl's face, remembered Daniel's passion for the model rockets they used to build together before Marcus got too busy, too important, too consumed by success to spend Saturday mornings in the garage with glue and paint and his son's excited chatter. He remembered the last conversation they'd had, how Daniel had asked him to come to the lake for the weekend, how Marcus had promised they'd go next time, how next time had never come because there was always another meeting, another deal, another rung on the ladder to climb while his son slipped further away until the day he slipped away permanently. He heard himself asking the girl her name, and she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and told him it was Lily. He asked if he could see the airplane, and she carefully placed the pieces on his table with a reverence that spoke of how precious this broken toy was to her. Marcus picked up the largest piece and examined it with the trained eye of someone who had spent his entire life understanding how things fit together. The airplane was beautifully made, crafted by hands that knew wood and took pride in their work. The brakes were clean enough that repair was possible, and he found himself calculating what he would need, how he would approach the restoration, finding himself engaged in problem solving for the first time in months in a way that had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. He told Lily that he thought he could fix it, that it would take some time and he'd need to take it with him to his workshop, but he could make it fly again. Her face transformed, grief giving way to hope so pure and complete that Marcus felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built from guilt and isolation beginning to crumble. She asked if he was sure, if he really meant it, and he promised her that he did, that he would treat it with the care it deserved, that he understood how important it was. She made him promise not to lose it, made him write down her grandmother's phone number so he could call when it was ready, and the seriousness with which she approached this transaction reminded him so much of Daniel that he had to look away to hide the sudden tears in his eyes. After Lily left, clutching the piece of paper with his phone number that he'd written down for her, Marcus sat staring at the broken airplane on his table. He should have returned to his reports, to his emails, to the endless demands of running a business empire. Instead, he closed his laptop, carefully gathered the pieces of the toy, wrapped them in his expensive linen napkin, and left the cafe with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since the day his son died. He drove not to his office but to his house, to the garage he hadn't entered in 7 years, where Daniel's tools and unfinished projects still sat exactly where they'd been left, preserved like a museum to his failure as a father. Opening that garage door felt like opening a tomb, and the smell that hit him, sawdust and paint and the ghost of his son's laughter, nearly drove him back to his car. But he forced himself to step inside, to turn on the lights, to look at the workbench where he and Daniel had spent so many happy hours before Marcus decided that building his company was more important than building memories with his son. He found wood glue and clamps, sandpaper and finish, and he cleared a space on the bench for Lily's airplane. Then he did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He picked up his tools and began to work with his hands, to create something, to fix something, to engage with the physical world instead of hiding behind screens and spreadsheets. The repair took him 3 days, working late into the nights after his employees had gone home and there was nothing left to distract him from his thoughts. He didn't just fix the brakes, he reinforced them, making the airplane stronger than it had been originally. He sanded away the scratches and reapplied the finish, bringing out the beauty of the wood grain that Lily's father had chosen. He cleaned and polished every surface, treating this simple toy with the same meticulous attention he once gave to million-dollar projects. And as he worked, something began to shift inside him. The repetitive motions of sanding and the careful precision of gluing became a kind of meditation, and in that meditation he began to think about things he'd been avoiding for 7 years. He thought about Daniel, really thought about him for the first time since the funeral, allowing himself to remember not just the loss but the joy, the laughter, the 1,000 small moments that had made up their relationship before Marcus had let work consume everything. He thought about the choice he'd made to prioritize his business over his son, the meetings he'd attended instead of soccer games, the client dinners that had replaced family dinners, the slow erosion of connection that he'd told himself was temporary, that success required sacrifice, that there would be time later to be the father he meant to be. He thought about Lily, about her mother working 2 jobs, about how this girl had lost her father not to neglect but to death, to circumstances beyond anyone's control, and how she treasured this broken toy because it was all she had left of the man who had clearly loved her enough to make something beautiful with his own hands. And Marcus began to understand something that grief had obscured for 7 years. That Daniel's death hadn't been his punishment for being a bad father, that the universe wasn't that cruel or that just. But his response to Daniel's death, the way he'd shut down and shut everyone out, the way he'd let guilt calcify into isolation, that was a choice he'd been making every day since. He'd been so consumed by what he'd failed to give Daniel while he was alive that he'd forgotten to honor what they had shared. The good years before work became his mistress, the foundation of love that had been real even if he'd built on it poorly in the end. When the airplane was finished, Marcus held it up to the light and felt something he'd forgotten was possible. Pride in work well done, satisfaction in having created something with his hands, connection to the child who would receive this gift and to the father who had made it originally. He called Lily's grandmother, and they arranged to meet at the cafe the next day. When he walked in carrying the restored airplane wrapped carefully in tissue paper, Lily was already there with her grandmother, a weathered woman whose eyes held kindness. Despite obvious hardship, Lily jumped up when she saw him, her face bright with anticipation, and Marcus knelt down to her level as he unwrapped the airplane and placed it in her hands. The look on her face was worth more than every deal he'd ever closed, every accolade he'd ever received, every zero in his bank account. She turned the plane over in her hands, examining it from every angle, running her fingers over the smooth wood, and then she looked up at him with tears streaming down her face and threw her arms around his neck in a hug that nearly knocked him over. She whispered thank you over and over, and Marcus found himself hugging her back, this child who was a stranger but who had somehow given him back a piece of himself he'd thought was lost forever. Her grandmother thanked him too, tried to offer him money which he refused, and in the conversation that followed Marcus learned about their struggles, about medical bills from her son's cancer, about the challenges of single parenthood, about the way poverty grinds people down but doesn't always break them. Before they left, Marcus did something impulsive, something the old Marcus would never have considered. He asked if Lily might like to come to his workshop sometimes, to learn about building things, to maybe work on projects together. He said he had a garage full of tools that weren't being used and he'd like to teach someone who was interested, no strings attached, just an old engineer sharing his knowledge with someone who might appreciate it. Lily's grandmother looked skeptical, protective of her granddaughter in the way people become when life has taught them that offers of help often come with hidden costs. But Lily looked up at Marcus with such hope in her eyes that her grandmother slowly nodded, and they exchanged phone numbers with the understanding that this was the beginning of something, though none of them quite knew what yet. Over the months that followed, Lily became a regular visitor to Marcus's garage workshop. She came every Saturday morning, and together they built birdhouses and wooden toys and small pieces of furniture that Marcus donated to the women's shelter where Lily's grandmother volunteered. He taught her about measurements and angles, about the properties of different woods, about the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands. But more than that, they talked. Lily told him about her father, about her memories of him, about how she was afraid she'd forget his face or his voice. And Marcus, slowly and painfully, began to tell her about Daniel, about the son he'd lost, about the regrets that had been eating him alive for 7 years. If this story has touched your heart, if you've felt the weight of regret or the hope of redemption, please take a moment to like this video and let us know in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that it's never too late to honor the people we've lost by choosing to really live. And if you believe in the power of second chances and unexpected connections, please subscribe to our channel because we all need these reminders that grace arrives in the most surprising ways. Lily listened with the wisdom that children sometimes possess when life has forced them to grow up too quickly, and she told Marcus something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. She said her grandmother told her that the best way to keep her daddy alive was to live the kind of life that would make him proud, to be kind like he was kind, to create things like he created things, to love people the way he'd loved her. She said maybe Marcus could honor Daniel the same way, not by hiding from the world but by being in it, by using his gifts to help people, by building connections instead of walls. And in the simple clarity of a child's perspective, Marcus finally saw the path forward. He began to change, not dramatically but steadily, like a river carving new channels through rock. He stepped back from the day-to-day operations of his company and refocused on designing affordable housing projects for low-income families. He started a scholarship fund in Daniel's name for kids who'd lost parents. He volunteered at the community center teaching woodworking classes. He began dating again, cautiously, opening his heart to the possibility of love without feeling like he was betraying his son's memory. And through it all, Lily was there, this remarkable child who had walked up to a stranger in a cafe and asked for help, who had somehow known that the man sitting alone needed fixing just as much as her broken toy. Years later, when Lily graduated high school and won a full scholarship to study engineering, Marcus sat in the audience beside her mother and grandmother and felt a fullness in his chest that he'd thought he'd never experience again. She'd asked him to be there, told him that he'd been like a father to her in the years since her dad died, that the time in his workshop had taught her not just about building things but about healing from loss while still honoring what you'd lost. And Marcus understood that this girl, this brave child who'd approached him with a broken airplane and a desperate hope, had given him the greatest gift anyone could receive, the chance to be present for another child's life in all the ways he'd failed to be present for his own son. If you've stayed with us through this entire journey, please leave a comment telling us about a moment when someone's kindness changed your life, or about a time you chose to help someone even when it was hard. Your stories matter and they inspire us all. The truth is that we all carry broken toys, broken dreams, broken pieces of ourselves that we don't know how to fix. We all have regrets that haunt us and losses that hollow us out from the inside. But sometimes healing arrives in the form of a child's request, a stranger's need, an opportunity to stop focusing on our own pain long enough to ease someone else's. Sometimes the act of fixing something broken outside ourselves begins to repair what's broken within us. And sometimes the greatest gift we can give is our presence, our time, our willingness to show up and use whatever gifts we have to make one small corner of the world a little less broken. Marcus never forgot that Tuesday afternoon, never stopped being grateful for the moment Lily walked up to his table and trusted him with her most precious possession. That wooden airplane, that last gift from a father who'd loved her enough to build something beautiful with his own hands, had become the vehicle for Marcus's own redemption. It had reminded him that love doesn't die when people do, that it lives on in the things they create, the people they touch, the connections they inspire in others. And it had taught him that it's never too late to honor the dead by choosing to truly live, to take the broken pieces of your grief and build something new, something that would have made them proud. Thank you for watching, for listening, for believing that stories like this matter. If you found hope in these words, please subscribe and join our community of people who believe in second chances and the transformative power of human kindness.